Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Day in History. And it's a special edition of This Day in History because the gentleman we're going to look at tonight, all the major events that he is remembered for, and for the purposes of this video, all happened in rather rapid succession, a 3-day period, really. He was born on March 27, 1912. And he died on March the 26th, 2005, one day before his 93rd birthday. And he was effectively ousted as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom on March 28, 1979, in a vote of no confidence, which he lost by one vote. I'm, of course, speaking of James Callaghan, who served as Prime Minister from April of 1976 until April 5th until May the 4th, 1979. Callaghan, when he would lose, would be the last Labour Prime Minister for 18 years. He would usher in Thatcherism, and she would, of course, be replaced by Prime Minister John Major. And, of course, Thatcher's reign as Prime Minister is very significant for the fact that she was the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the only female to ever stand for election and win an outright majority as the leader of a major party in the United Kingdom. Theresa May took over the Conservative Party with a majority in 2016, but called a by-election in 2017. That was a huge political miscalculation in which she lost her majority and eventually would resign as Prime Minister in 2019. And, of course, the current Prime Minister is Boris Johnson, who in the 2019 elections won a substantial majority. But back to Callaghan. Callaghan led a minority government. He took over for Harold Wilson, and often he had to make deals with minor parties, and he that coalition would eventually crumble. He is the only person to have held all four great offices of state. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the equivalent of the Treasury Secretary in the United States. The Home Secretary, which is kind of a cross between Attorney General, Homeland Security, and Intelligence. And the Foreign Secretary, which of course is the equivalent of the United States Secretary of State or Foreign Ministers in other countries. He held those prior to his premiership. He is chiefly remembered, though, during his prime ministership for the winter of discontent. It was a very cold winter, and he had huge fights with trade unions over pay and pay freezes. And these strikes by these trade unions were huge inconveniences to the public. You had strikes among sanitation workers, grave diggers, petrol drivers. I mean, it was horrible. And it was very cold winter. It's one of the coldest winters in the country's history. And there was blizzard and deep snow. And he also is remembered for the quote of "What crisis?" He was asked by a reporter for the Sun, um, about what is your general approach in view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment. And I'm sorry, it was the Evening Standard. The Sun would run with the headline, Crisis, What Crisis? But what is your general approach in view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment? Callaghan replied, well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise that if you look at it from outside and perhaps taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that people in the world would share the view that there is a mounting crisis. And of course, that was seen as just a horrible statement of being out of touch. And the Labour Party would suffer horribly in the polls. One poll before the election showed the Labour Party down 20%. And a lot of people, he would later go on to admit that this statement really was a huge blunder. And another blunder that he has was he didn't call an election in 1978. Most people generally agree that if Callaghan had called an election in 1978, he would have been able to survive and win that election, and probably would have been able to survive a vote of no confidence. But he was unable to win the vote of no confidence, and that led to the dissolution, to the Queen dissolving Parliament because he asked for a general election. And in the general election, Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative Party would prevail, and she would ask to form a government from the Queen. It would be granted, and she would serve as Prime Minister. And then after her, John Major would take over as leader of the Conservative Party. Major would win an election in his own right in 1992. That election is famous because the networks in the United Kingdom got the exit poll horribly wrong. They said a Labour government, and the voters said a Conservative government. And of course, John Major would be voted out in a rout in 1997. Tony Blair would win a landslide. Interestingly enough, in that election, a young Labour organizer called Callaghan and asked if he would be interested in getting more involved in politics, and he said, well, I was a Labour Prime Minister. I think I've done my part. There's that. So I just wanted to kind of do this special edition to talk about James Callaghan and his horrible luck. He really had an impressive career, except for that prime ministership. As I said, he would be the last Labour prime minister for 18 years, and would lead to Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and the like. I know about a week ago I did the losing vice presidential candidates. I also have the ability to go back and name all the British prime ministers up to the start of World War II. You have Neville Chamberlain, Churchill, Clement Attlee, Churchill again, Macmillan, Eaton. Then you would have Hume. Then you would have, after that, you'd have Harold Wilson. And then you would have Edward Heath. And then you would have Wilson again. And You would also have Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, and Johnson. But it's really kind of just it's a lot different than our form of government here in the United States. But I felt that it would be interesting to cover Mr. Callaghan tonight because I was looking at the calendar and I realized, oh, all of this is coming up right here together. And instead of doing one video where I kind of cover it generally, I just wanted to do one video where I covered it all because I believe it deserved a broader discussion. And when we get closer to dates of significance around Margaret Thatcher, I will, of course, cover Mrs. Thatcher because she is a very important figure in this drama as well, possibly more important than Mr. Callaghan. But his failures as Prime Minister led to her becoming Prime Minister. It's kind of like there's no Ronald Reagan without Jimmy Carter. I also kind of believe that anyone that would have been Prime Minister during this time would have failed. Just like whoever won the election of 1976 would have failed. But just the dynamics were there for there to be political upheaval. You can also say that it kind of led to a conservative revolution around the world, a right-of-center revolution. Because after World War I, you had all of these more left-of-center governments take hold around the world. And Trudeau in Canada, Johnson and Kennedy in the United States, to an extent. Eisenhower, I think most people today would consider Eisenhower to be a progressive politician. Nixon certainly expanded the power of state and government, and you begin to see the backlash to that building up in the late 70s and definitely the early 80s. You would see Thatcher, Reagan, Mulrooney, just all of these conservative politicians around the world. And I think the balance is shifting in the world kind of more, I don't want to say toward more left governments, because obviously in the United Kingdom recently a very progressive out front leader lost a general election. But I do think the tide is turning against conservatism as we know it today. In general, I think that the world is drifting towards more populist governments, and that is, to me, somewhat concerning. I believe both right-wing and left-wing populism are very, very dangerous ideologies to have promoting themselves. So, yes, Mr. Callaghan lived a very long life, as I said, and he was the longest-lived former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in history. So I will see you all later. Have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.